Hello everyone, welcome to KnowHow Webinars. As you know, this is an online platform for professional education that is managed by TechnoBiz. Today we are here for the program called Meet KnowHow Webinar Experts. In this program, basically we introduce our experts and explain about their expertise and also what kind of webinars they did. Basically through their words, not I present themselves. I mean, basically they tell about themselves and also the programs they conducted through for the KnowHow Webinars. Today we have here our expert is Dr. Graeme Pearce, and he's our expert, and he specializes on the membrane technology. Just to give you a brief introduction about Dr. Graeme Pearce. He is a very well-known, well-experienced membrane technology specialist. I think we will know more about him through his own words. With 30+ years experience, and currently have a company called Membrane Consultancy Associates based in UK. He has contributed a number of webinars focusing on the EFMF filtration. There are altogether 16 webinars. We will learn about all these webinars one by one as we move on to the program. He also covered on the ceramic membranes, also on the MBR, membrane bioreactors. Okay. Dr. Graeme, welcome to the program on the Meet KnowHow Webinar Expert. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you.
So let's get to know about you more, okay? And I'd like to ask you, talk about your company first and give us some glimpse about information on what is this company, what you're doing about it. Okay, so please share.
Thank you very much, Param. So I've been involved in my own consultancy company since 2005, so 16 years now. Prior to that, I worked for a major membrane supplier, and I also worked for my own system company in the 1990s. And prior to that, I worked with BP. So when in BP, I got involved in membrane applications. And in my own system company, that was focused on filtration and membrane duties. And with hydronautics, I was also involved in the membrane program there. And the idea of my company was to try to improve the experience of users of membrane technology. So what I was finding in the early days of membranes, that people were having problems and issues and potentially misapplying the technology, or some mistakes were being made. And I thought it would be good to have a consultancy which helped people to apply their technology more effectively and to avoid some of those mistakes and to learn from the experience of the industry.
Okay, share more light into your professional journey, your experience over 30+ years experience in the membrane industry. So can you talk more about it?
I got involved initially through looking at applications within the oil industry and the chemical industry through BP. And then we started focusing on water treatment, and BP set up a venture capital startup funded company through its own venture capital business, and then it allowed us to buy that company out. And so we then took our own independent little company into the market to look at applications within water treatment to try to introduce new filtration technologies and new membrane technologies to water treatment. So my professional journey was involved in introducing this new technology as it was then, and it was very difficult to introduce it. People were very reluctant initially to accept that membranes could have a place within the water industry. They were deemed to be too expensive, too difficult to use, too delicate, not lasting long enough. So they had a whole lot of problems that they had hanging over them. On the upside, of course, was the fact that they were a barrier technology, which was very much very desirable. So you had this perception of expense against the hope for a Rolls-Royce performance, if you like, a top-of-the-line performance. And the problems that were encountered, though, by the initial experience of trying to apply that technology then caused some people to say, well, we've spent all this money on something that we thought would be fit and forget, that would be excellent in its operation, and we find that it has problems, it has issues, and it's not as easy and it's not as good as we first thought. And it was that problem of the application of the technology which attracted me into this area and eventually attracted me into consultancy. So I've now been operating for 16 years as a consultant. I do a lot of troubleshooting assignments, but I also help companies comment on their technology and look at their competitive positioning. And I help companies with, as an expert witness in case there's a dispute, because not everything works out. And so they are the various different aspects of my company operation.
So, thank you for sharing some light into your activities that you've done in the past and currently what you're doing. For the audience purpose, I would like to ask a few general questions, okay, and for them to understand what is going on in the membrane technology. I'll share the question: what is happening, the current trends in the membrane technology? What kind of things happening in the current membrane technology right now?
So, so membrane technology started out with a number of different polymers, and it gradually focused in on the two polymers that we currently use, polyethersulfone and PVDF. And the membrane industry has become largely consolidated around these two polymers. And so we have been focusing in the last few years on how best to apply these two polymers. They both have very different product formats and modes of operation. So there are differences between them, but within each of those polymer classes, there's a lot of similarity in the way that they're operated. But I suppose looking at what is now the current trend at present and going forward, I would say it's the introduction of ceramic membrane technology to complement what is achieved by polymerics. So ceramics have been considered, as polymerics themselves were at the start, have been considered very expensive. So whereas the polymerics have gradually come down in price, the ceramics have taken longer to become competitive. But now they've reached that point at which they're starting to be competitive and are starting to be considered as a rival to polymerics. So I would say that's the biggest current trend of membrane technology. I have a website which is shown on the slide at the moment, www.membraneconsultancy.com. On that website, I have a blog, which I produce a blog every 4 to 6 weeks or so, in which I look at the current trends in the market, and I make comments on various issues. Quite often, they're issues to do with water treatment, drinking water quality. They might be to do with persistent mobile toxic compounds, for example. That's a big issue, and various other contaminants within water, how we address them, how we remove them. But I comment on a lot of other issues in the market, big trends and so on. So if you would like to see my current thoughts, that's the best place to look on that blog.
That's nice. Guys, whoever is watching this the program, please do visit the membraneconsultancy.com for his blog. I like his reports, particularly recently he did on the nano filtration. I really like the his input on it. So please check this website on a regular basis to watch out on the trends in the membrane technology. Graeme, you have involved in many projects, which in the design side as well as on the operational side. I just want your take on what people normally make, what kind of mistakes they do in terms of designer as well as operational, issues. Why some, membrane systems are expensive. You need to design properly, you need to operate properly. And based on your experience, what are the common mistakes usually happening in design and
Yes,
operation side? Yeah.
I quite often find when I visit plants for troubleshooting, I see a repetition of similar mistakes. So in the early days of membranes, it was very common, and it still occurs, that we would find plants where the pressures were not controlled and the flows were not controlled, and you would get too big a change of pressure or change of flow, which would lead to maybe water hammer in the plant or excessive spikes in pressure. And of course, membranes are at least somewhat delicate, even though they've gradually improved over the years, but they need to be operated within their design envelope. If you subject it to water hammer, the chances are that the membrane will either be damaged and lose its permeability, or maybe even break. So those issues have been quite common. We quite often see that controlling the flow is difficult in a multi-rack plant with a number of individual operating units. The problem comes, how do you balance those units? How do you take units offline, bring them back online so that the whole system becomes balanced? Do you allow rapid changes or slow changes, etc.? So these are the sort of problems I often see. I mean, I think the other thing which I often come across is recycles within systems, where there may be chemicals added during the course of the process, and when you come to the recycle, those added chemicals, the excess or the residuals, are then taken back to the head of the plant, and it may be that those added chemicals are not compatible with the initial membrane treatment. Maybe they were added as a post-treatment, but they were not intended to go through back to the feed side. So quite often those hidden recycles, I always look carefully to see if there are hidden recycles, because often designers, it's not that straightforward to see them on the process flow sheets. It's surprising. You would think that you would see it easily, but you have to study it quite hard to see whether that is actually occurring, and quite often it is the source of problems.
You mentioned repetitive mistakes. I think people do the similar mistakes again and again. So
that's true.
You wrote a book, well-known book, I think very popular book about the UFMF membrane water treatment. Can you talk more about it? Of course, I'm happy to be part of that project, and so share some light on
So here's the book here, and I have a copy for handy reference by my side. I still, even though I wrote it a little while ago now, I still quite often refer to it myself. Yeah, so when I wrote that book, I wanted to encapsulate, if you like, what I knew about membranes and membrane design and all of the issues that I thought would be important. I suppose what I was trying to do was to write the book that I, as a new engineer, so when I entered the membrane water treatment field, I wanted to buy a book and read it to give me the grounding to get started, and there was no such book. And in fact, I don't really believe that any such book was written until I wrote my book. Of course, many books were written and they have their merits, of course they do, but I didn't find exactly the book that I hoped to see. So I wrote it for people who had their engineering education and they had experience of other water treatment, but they didn't know particularly about membranes in water treatment. And this book basically tells you all the things you need to know about membranes in water treatment to have a successful project, how to select membranes, and some basic design principles, to the options that you have for commercial membranes, and then how to apply those membranes and the sort of problems that you might encounter when you apply them. Actually, the book forms the basis of the webinar series that we're going to go on to discuss, and I take most of the key elements of the book and I form them into webinar modules, which has created this webinar series.
Okay, thank you, Graeme. Guys, if anybody interested in this book, this is a website that you can reach out and purchase that book, or you can also reach out to the Dr. Graeme for this, copy of the book. Okay, let's, we get into the, before we go into webinars, can you tell your experience with the KnowHow Webinar project, and also the, you are associated with TechnoBiz quite a number of years right now. So what is your impression and how was your interaction so far?
So Perham first contacted me about 12 years ago. And I was very surprised to be contacted. He rang me on a Sunday morning and he said to me, why don't I write a book? And I started by laughing because, of course, anyone who's written anything substantial knows that it's a big project. It's not an easy thing that you can just sit down in the afternoon and just write it. It takes a lot of effort. And so that was my first association with TechnoBiz. TechnoBiz at that time was quite focused on publishing, but it was getting involved in training webinars and conferences and this sort of thing. And so having done the book, I then started working with Perham on seminars and honed up my seminar series and did a whole range of physical seminars in different locations, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and other places as well. And in more recent years, we decided to bring some of this training online. So Perham produced his KnowHow Webinar program, and I was very pleased when Perham asked me to put my training online, because it's obviously great to do the training face to face, and it's a real pleasure to have the physical experience of teaching. You see the reaction of your audience members, your attendees. You get their feedback, you see when they understand what you're saying, and you see when they don't understand. You see what you're, whether there are shortcomings in what you're saying if you haven't explained things properly. So you get all of that feedback from physical seminars. You don't get that so easily from online training, but I suppose having gone through with Perham the process of providing physical training for a number of years, I certainly felt that I had at least I could lean on that previous experience to make sure that my online training was appropriate. So I've been very pleased to be involved in this program with Perham. It's been very interesting. It's forced me to bring all my information completely up to date. I spent quite a lot of time earlier this year in making sure that everything was as up to date as I could make it, and I tried to address the holes and the shortcomings of my programs as well as I could. And now we have this comprehensive series of webinars which cover the whole of my content. Perham mentioned on one of my recent blogs, I looked at the issue of nanofiltration. So nanofiltration does not form part of this particular series that we're talking about, but it will form part of a future set of webinars that I will do, because I want to expand and make sure that my content remains relevant, and expand to include new developments and related developments from closely allied fields to membrane filtration, and nanofiltration is going to be the next activity.
Yeah, it's actually, thank you very much, sharing your experience with the TechnoBiz and me. I'm happy to know about it. Definitely, there is nothing beats with the in-person program. This online program is an alternative way of learning for our client bases or professionals to learn. But we will have, once this COVID scenario over, we will have physical programs as well as online. Both goes together. We have to live with it, both online activity as well as the physical programs. So let's hope that everybody safe to travel. Then we can back to those past days again. Yeah. So Graeme, I'd like to ask you to, each webinar, we have altogether 16 webinars altogether we have by you, and you can talk about each webinar one by one. I'll show on the screen. Okay. So this is the first webinar, and you go ahead with explaining about it is. Yeah.
So what I wanted to do in the first module was to look at the fundamentals of membrane filtration membranes. So this is ultrafiltration and microfiltration, and look at the materials and the options that we had. So I look at the historical context of what the original materials were, but then focusing more on the materials that we use in the current day. Of course, this webinar focuses on the polymerics. I'll talk about the ceramics later on. So we looked at the basics, the mechanisms for how it works, and those materials. And then in this webinar, we also look at the key issue of fouling. So membranes start off when they're pristine, the performance is incredibly high, but even within the first few minutes or hours of use, they start to become fouled, and certainly within days or weeks of use, they become quite fouled, and then they have a new steady state of performance which is much below where they started. And the whole key to membranes is how can you maintain that conditioned steady state? So you have to accept that some fouling has happened, and then you have to maintain the future level with cleaning and operational practices to make sure that you can return to this conditioned state. So not a pristine state, but a conditioned state, which gives you an acceptable performance, which will be cost effective going forward. So this first module addresses those fundamentals at the introductory level, if you like. I should say that all of the modules are standalone. They are designed to be complete and comprehensive in covering the particular topic. So all 16 modules are closely related, and they move from one to the next, but each one is standalone in its content and can be taken on board as a separate entity if required, or a group could be taken on as a series, but it's clearly beneficial if you take the whole 16 module course. So the second webinar looks in more detail at how we make membranes. The term morphology, not a common term within normal everyday use of English, but if you're a membrane person, you've probably come across this. And it's a description of what the membrane looks like inside. If you take a cross section of it, for example, across the depth of the membrane, if you look at the surface and you look at a two-dimensional shot of the surface. The morphology, basically, it's a description of what the membrane looks like, and the way that you make the membrane will determine the morphology of its structure, and in turn, that morphology and the polymer that you chose will determine the characteristics of the membrane, how it behaves with certain water types and certain contaminants, and what character it has in its performance and operation. So in this second module, I'm looking at these issues of how we make membranes, what their structure, morphology looks like, and what the corresponding characteristics are of the membrane that we've made. I then come on to the issue of format and product options and look at what choices we have in producing our products. So the interesting thing about membrane formats is when we started in the membrane industry for water, there were a few different options that were considered, and we still have quite a few of those possible choices. And in fact, I tend to think of them in terms of a series of binary choices, such as, do we operate our membranes with cross-flow, which means a continuous velocity through the feed channel, or do we operate them dead end with backwash so that we stop the flow and then we periodically clean? Of course, that has the advantage of saving cost of cross-flow, but it has the disadvantages that it doesn't keep the membrane so clean. So that's one binary choice. And then another binary choice might be, do we have an inside feed format where the feed is in the lumen or the channel of the membrane, or do we have an outside feed format where the feed is in the shell and the filtrate is in the lumen? So along with other possible binary choices, this determines what the products look like. And the products we have today are the consequence of the binary choices that we made. And in this webinar, I examined this issue of what product options do we have before us when we consider membranes for water filtration duties. We then go on in this fourth module to look at the issue of process design. So how do we design a membrane process? And very importantly, how do we choose the flux? Of course, the higher flux we choose, the fewer membranes we need, but the more fouling and the higher running cost we're likely to encounter. So choosing the flux is a compromise, if you like, between capital costs, which are reduced by having a high flux, and operating costs, which are reduced by having a low flux. So somewhere in the middle, there's an optimum flux, which you might call a sustainable flux for that process, and that will be the ideal flux to choose. And so it's clear that this will be the most important decision that a membrane process designer will have to make. And depending upon the flux, you might have a design that has a lot of cleaning and a lot of operating cost, or you might have a design with less. And so process design and flux selection go hand in hand and are the critical issue, if you like, for the membrane process designer. So once we've designed our process, you then need to translate that into a system design. So really what this is looking at is the issue of how many racks or subunits do we have. So the way that a membrane plant is designed is that you need a certain number of membranes to do the job, but you divide that membrane into a number of groupings, and then you get each of those groups, which might be subunits or racks, to do the same thing at the same time. And you then have a sequence which allows those groupings or subunits to operate with the other subunits in the total system, with some being backwashed or cleaned, while others are in filtration. And you have quite a number of important issues in balancing the operation across that whole grouping, how you control the flow, the sort of variations that you allow in Flux, depending upon how many units are available, what redundancy requirements there are, what the pipework diameters might be, what the tank requirements might be for cleaning, or maybe for hold up or balancing, or these sort of issues. So the sixth webinar of the series then starts to consider, well, what are our commercial membrane options? Let's have a look at the suppliers and review their offerings. So there's quite a few suppliers, more than a dozen, who are active internationally. And this webinar looks at all of those main international suppliers and compares their product offerings. So the product offerings are put into groups which are similar to each other, and then the groups are compared with the other groups, which again are similar to each other but different from the first group. And there are 3 such groups which are reviewed in this particular webinar. We look at some comparison within the groups, and we look at comparison between the groups. And then that gives us an overall feel for the sort of choices and options that we have in front of us when we are trying to select a membrane which would be suitable for our application. I mean, it turns out that in different parts of the world, in different geographies, some format options are preferred to others, and that choice may be different in another geography. Also, for some applications, some product groupings are preferred to others. So the choices are not as straightforward as one might consider, and all of the products that we have available, we find that in different circumstances they can be closely competitive. So it keeps the choices that we make have to be under very active review in order to make the best possible decisions in each circumstance. So I then go on in the 7th webinar to look at the issue of how do we monitor performance of a plant once we've designed it. So we had a number of choices to make. We bought the membranes, we built the plant, we installed it. We're now operating it. How do we tell whether it's performing stably? Of course, from a water quality point of view, you just do some water analysis and you either are meeting your requirements or not. It turns out that with membrane filtration, you nearly always meet the water quality requirements. It's very rare for the plant to underperform in terms of water quality because the membrane is a barrier process. So provided the barrier is intact, you will meet the quality. Of course, what is more challenging, and much more challenging, I should say, is whether it's stable with time. So you may meet the quality, but you may not, or you may struggle to meet the quantity that's required because maybe the membrane is fouling and not responding to its cleaning. So it's very important to monitor the performance, which is really the quantity or the output and the flow rate of the plant. And the way that we monitor that is by measuring the flow and the pressure, and between them, the flow and the pressure indicates the permeability, which is the just indicated by the calculation of flow over pressure. So the permeability trend tells us whether in the long term the plant has a stable operation which can be maintained, or whether it's trending downwards and will give us a problem at some point in the future with maybe premature membrane changing or some other crisis. So a very important webinar for the users of membranes to really understand where their plant is going. So the 8th webinar then looks at applications and case studies. So what we're looking at here is where we apply membranes in water treatment. So whether it's drinking water or seawater RO pretreatment, wastewater reuse, or various industrial water treatment. Those are the 4 categories that we look at, and the issues involved in those different applications are examined in this. So in the case of drinking water, an important issue is integrity and the measurement of integrity and the repair of membranes that lose their integrity, because in drinking water treatment, having a guaranteed barrier to microorganisms is critical. And so monitoring the integrity and ensuring that the membrane continues to meet that integrity is the main important factor. As a contrast, within seawater RO pretreatment, we're normally not so interested in the integrity, because normally if there are slight breaches in integrity, it doesn't affect water quality from an RO pretreatment perspective too badly. But the issue that we are more likely to encounter is to do with fouling and potential biofouling of the RO. So the issues are, how do we operate the UF pretreatment in order not to create a biofouling problem on the RO? In wastewater reuse, issues are different again, because we're looking at a much higher degree of challenge, and we're looking at membranes in the context of a number of treatment processes operating in series. And these issues are illustrated through case studies in the different segments of the water market to show showcase the main issues that we have to consider. So the 9th webinar is more focused now on fouling. So the issue of fouling was introduced as a problem in the first webinar, and the simple approaches to addressing that problem were discussed. Here in the 9th webinar, we now look in much more detail at the issue of fouling and how we might use chemicals to control fouling, and particularly the sorts of chemicals that are needed in different applications, how those chemicals might react with different materials. So PVDF and polyethylsulfone have different resilience and resistance levels to those foulants. And then we can also look at the issue of whether we used chemical enhanced backwash or clean in place, or whether we use dosing chemicals to try to ameliorate fouling effects. And so chemicals are very important in membrane filtration. We tend to use less specialty chemicals in UF than in RO, where specialty chemicals, especially for cleaning, are more or less mandatory. In UF, there is much more use of basic commodity chemicals, but then it has been found that if we can enhance those by occasional use of specialty chemicals, or some combined use of specialty chemicals with commodity chemicals, or intermittent use of specialities, you can get much more stable long-term performance. So this webinar discusses these various issues of chemical use. The operational issues of the membrane plant would encompass both the proving of integrity. So we looked at in the applications webinar the importance of integrity. This webinar then looks at how we monitor integrity, the sort of level of integrity loss that we potentially can accept, and the repair that we might have to do if the integrity is lost. It looks at physically how we do the repair, and it looks at other issues that we might encounter, such as disinfection of the membrane, because the membrane, although a physical barrier, it's not a completely sterile environment, so issues of disinfection can still be important. And it looks at also issues of storage, rotation of plant which is not fully utilized, and such like. So the 11th webinar looks at troubleshooting. So we've designed our plant, we've installed it, we're operating, we're monitoring performance, everything is fine, but then over time, maybe problems develop. I mentioned in my introductory comments that I quite often see the repeat of some age-old problems, and in this troubleshooting webinar, we look at the causes of membrane problems and the resolution of those problems. We look at through photographs and scanning electron micrographs, we look at how the problems can be identified, and we look at the sorts of actions we can take in order to reverse those problems. So the problems tend to fall into various groupings, and you find that with the different membrane formats, you maybe have different sorts of problems. So each format might have its own set of problems, which may be avoided by the other format, but the other format has its own problems. And it's a question then of just understanding what can be done about these issues and how we should try to minimize the occurrence of problems. So in the 12th webinar, so this is the final webinar of the polymeric membrane section for straightforward membrane filtration duties. In this final webinar, I look at new developments, recent trends, and future prospects. So what I'm doing here is just taking some things I've noticed about developments in the industry and making some forecasts and so on. So it looks at market trends, product development trends. As an example, it may be that modules are increasing in size, and there may be a trend towards replaceable and interchangeable modules. There may be a trend towards different materials. There may be some market trends, such as towards universal racks with interchangeable modules from different suppliers. So a number of issues. And this webinar is updated from time to time as those issues develop. In the 13th webinar, I start to look at a very brief review of ceramic membranes. I say brief because there's only 2 webinars for this topic, because it's basically assuming that the fundamental knowledge of membranes has already been absorbed from the first 12 webinars. So again, these 2 webinars in ceramic membranes, 13 and 14, are standalone, but they do assume a strong knowledge of membranes and membrane filtration from the previous series. And it's looking at issues which are specific to ceramic membranes in the way that they differ from polymerics, so the way that the manufacturing differs, the principles of the ceramics differs, and where the applications are for which ceramics may be best suited, and what the performance expectation may be for ceramics. The second webinar in this short ceramic series looks at the commercial membranes being offered. So you have a number of tubular or lumen type products which are used in mainstream water treatment, and then you have a number of flat sheet options which are used in higher solids applications. And I'm looking at the various commercial offerings from different suppliers in these 2 groups of ceramic membrane types when I conduct this review. And the whole series concludes with a brief review of membrane bioreactors. Again, it's assuming a lot of knowledge of membranes in water filtration duties from the first 12 webinars, and it looks at issues which are specific to membrane bioreactors. So in this first webinar of the two webinar MBR series, I look at the basics of MBR and the technology and the process design. So the focus of this webinar is on the membrane module itself within the MBR design, but it does also look at the biology which is determining what the overall process design considerations are. And it looks at some technology options that you have within MBR, just as you have with membrane filtration. Those options are clearly somewhat different, whether it be flat sheet MBR or hollow fiber based MBR, or indeed side stream tubular MBR, and looks at the process design implications of those different options and how they would compare against each other. And the whole series concludes with a review of the leading commercial products. So the 2 groupings that or 3 groupings that I've referred to, the leading dozen or so MBR suppliers, their products are reviewed, compared between each other within the groups and across groups, and the issues and the problems that you might encounter with MBR are also discussed. So that concludes the overall set of webinars that I've provided here.
Thank you, Graeme. Thank you very much for explaining so that the audience understands clearly all the 16 topics that you covered, from the from fundamentals to design and operational and troubleshooting aspects of the UFMF filtration. We are receiving positive feedback for regular participants from your program. Would you like to share some welcome message, a thank you message to the participants in the past who joined, and also the welcoming them for the future participants as well?
So I found that the engagement with the material has been very strong from participants in the past, and they have certainly asked very good questions which explore those issues that I've introduced. Clearly, in my webinars, I'm trying to give a comprehensive description, but you know, there's always extra discussion that you can have. And in the webinars, we have a recorded Q&A. We can add to that Q&A through separate specific Q&A each time the webinar is provided. I'm very happy to do that. I found that those questions have helped me to develop my material over time. So I'm always interested in receiving the questions, and it allows me to make sure that it's more and more focused and more well explained for the future.
Thank you, Graeme. You know, as guys, you know, Dr. Graeme is well respected, well experienced, you know, the membrane technologist. All the 16 webinars, I'm sure it's pretty hard work. It's similar to like writing a book, okay? And so, you know, he's available if you're looking for any customized program, or if you wanted to have a brainstorming session. He's involved in the design, he's doing the troubleshooting, everything about membrane technology. I'm sure he can give you the best guidance for any of your projects. So please be in touch, and you know, please do read his book. This is kind of Bible on the you know, UFM membrane filtration. Thanks once again, Dr. Graeme, for sharing your input, all the program, all the your topics, and also I believe that audience understand you more with your expertise, as well as what they gain out of this KnowHow webinar. So before we end this program now, I just quickly give you the audience some additional information about KnowHow webinar. As you see, KnowHow webinar is a purely educational platform, online platform. As TechnoBiz is basically, before COVID, we were more into the in-person programs, and we face-to-face discussions. A lot of extensive programs are there. Because of COVID, we get into this for online education. It's been getting popular, and I encourage you to be the member. As you know, working with like Dr. Graeme, you know, he's not just 16. We'll be adding more. As you see, he's saying that the questions received from the audience also improving the content of the, you know, as a webinar in the future. So so it's better to be encourage you to be the member of the KnowHow webinar. There are a couple of options are there, and see, before you go to member, why do you have to be a member? It's all about quality learning and the education. Basically, TechnoBiz and myself, I like to work with the best, just like Dr. Graeme, because if we work with the best, we can deliver the best. That's as simple as that. There is no secret about it. It's just basically a simple formula: work with the best to deliver the best. People like Dr. Graeme. That's why you need to be the member of the KnowHow webinar. All the program you see here, there are lots. There are more are coming in our platform. All are international, well experienced, and everybody got 25, 30, 40 years experience in their respective field. So we offer, if you want to look at what kind of topics are available, we cover a broad range, not only on the membrane technology or the polymer technology, energy environment. We are adding more topics, but it's mainly aimed for the professionals in the industry or in the business. We have various memberships. We have professional member, corporate member. We also inviting education institutes also to take our programs as a part of the student curriculum, because all these topics are, you know, given by well experienced people. We have premium professional member and a premium corporate member. So these are we offering now as a member. So please, if you're interested, you can check our website. This is a link and the how to be a member of the KnowHow webinar. Okay, and this is me. I think you know how to reach me, my email or WhatsApp or mobile, and all through website. So if you need any assistance, please be in touch with me. Before we end the program, one more time, thank you, Dr. Graeme, and anything that I'd like to add, you know, before we, you know, sign off. Yeah.
So I'd just like to re-emphasize the fact that if you want to keep up to date with my latest thoughts and my latest thinking, I have a blog on my website, and I cover these topics. And so, as you know, Perham mentioned the nanofiltration as an example, and you know, I've referred to it in a couple of blogs, and this will be my next series. last year, I did a similar thing in ceramic membranes, and gradually writing the blog sort of it generated my own interest, and then I included that in an extension of the webinar series. So, you know, if there's a topic you think I should be covering in my blog, you could maybe let me know through the contact page on my website, or you could just look at my website blog and look at that, and you'll see what the latest sort of thinking is, and get involved in the debate about you know, where our industry is going and what's new, what's developing, what's coming up. So it's just it's a platform that allows this discussion and this development of ideas. So I just like to leave you with that thought.
I do re-emphasize again, please do check his blog. He reviews very well. I really like these writings, and the way he analytical in report wise, one of the best writer and best reviewer on the membrane technology. So please follow his web blog. I really encourage all of you. Thank you once again, Dr. Graeme, and being part of the guys. Thank you for being part of the KnowHow webinar journey. Please be in touch. Any assistance you need, you can contact us. Also, Dr. Graeme, the membrane guy. Okay, if you need some help, assistance on your projects, you know whom to contact. That is Dr. Graeme Pearce. Thank you once again. Bye bye for now.
Thanks. Bye.